Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to The Heartbeat, the place where I talk about just a few of the things that make this little guy tick. Today, I'm going to be talking about Aaron Sorkin and Danny Boyle's Steve Jobs. Join me, won't you? So, the film Steve Jobs focuses on three distinct points in the Apple creator's life. The 1984 product release of the first Macintosh, the 1988 release of the Next computer, and the 1998 release of the first iMac. And in each of those instances, what we're not shown is actually the presentation itself. That very geniusly crafted, undeniably brilliant presentation that Steve Jobs does on stage. We're actually shown literally behind the curtain. We go backstage where we get to know Steve Jobs more as a person. What he's striving towards, potentially what he's running from, and kind of whether or not he is the man that we all think we know. And I think one thing that needs to be pointed out from the outset is this really isn't a biopic in the sense that each of those acts just focuses on those three distinct points, and not a whole lot more. As one interviewer pointed out, there's never a mention of Pixar, an iPhone, or cancer. It is more than anything a character study on the person of Steve Jobs versus a cradle-to-the-grave retelling of his life. And not to sound like a broken record like I say each time, but I really was looking forward to this film in a big way. I'm a huge fan of Aaron Sorkin, and have really had to wait a long time for this project to be released. It's kind of been passed from numerous hands, one to the next for quite a while. And one of the pair of hands that it rested in for a while was actually David Fincher. And you might know him from The Social Network, which was also another team-up between David Fincher and Aaron Sorkin. And I loved The Social Network. There was a polish to it, there was an intelligence to it, and the thought that he and Sorkin would be once again teaming up on Steve Jobs was exciting, but there was an element of almost predictability in my mind. I could almost picture what exactly this film would look like, because I kind of felt like I'd already experienced a taste of what Sorkin and Fincher would do with kind of a sociopathic genius who forged a big element of our society. So when Fincher dropped out, I was sad for a moment, but then extremely excited hearing that Danny Boyle had signed on, because Danny Boyle has an extremely eclectic filmography. You look at Trainspotting, 28 Days Later, Millions, Slumdog Millionaire, 127 Hours. Each of those films are so distinct and so different. This project now had that level of unpredictability. I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to get going in, and that electrified me. Also, you'll notice that back when I introduced the film, I said it is Aaron Sorkin and Danny Boyle's Steve Jobs versus just Danny Boyle's Steve Jobs. And that really is because Aaron Sorkin is a household name. If you know him from The West Wing, if you know him from The Social Network, or Newsroom, or Sports Night, or A Few Good Men, he is a writer that has such a distinct voice. He's become as noteworthy, if not more noteworthy, than the directors that actually make his film. Which is so completely refreshing in an industry that is constantly producing projects that have 3+ writers on them. And not 3+ writers that were brought in at the same time and asked to collaborate with one another, but at different distinct points, bringing different distinct points of views and voices to that screenplay, ones that don't always mesh up in a good cohesive way. But on this situation, it wasn't just refreshing, but fitting that Sorkin was on board. I feel like there are a number of similarities between both Jobs and Sorkin, in the sense that both are kind of obsessed with creating a closed system, so to speak. With Jobs, obviously, it's the Mac products, and with Sorkin, it's his screenplays. You definitely get a sense of that when hearing Sorkin talk about his writing process, whether it be the years of research he does on any given project, or the fact that he chooses to write every single episode of an entire series, like The Newsroom. And like Jobs, on the other side of that rather obsessive work comes this brilliant piece of art which has this intense rhythm, and this extremely intelligent propulsion, and this kind of witty poetry almost, which, when it comes out of the mouth of Steve Jobs, doesn't feel forced or unnatural or showy for the sake of showy, because, after all, he is Steve Jobs. So like Mark Zuckerberg in The Social Network or the President in The West Wing, this yet again feels like a match made in heaven when it comes to Aaron Sorkin and this subject matter. But it wasn't just the dialogue that ruled in this film, it was really the structure, and it was completely unique to Sorkin, who is a self-professed playwright at heart. And he loves compressed time, tight spaces, and a ticking clock, and he used that to the max in this film. The film was almost 2 hours of talking, and it was so rewarding that it almost breezed by in such an enjoyable way. This is not just a Sorkin film, though. In the same way that you can hear him in every single line of dialogue, you can really feel Danny Boyle in every single frame that's presented on screen. And though I mentioned earlier, Danny Boyle does have a very eclectic filmography ranging from horror to thriller to drama, there is something recognizable that ties all of his films together. And it's a style and it's a tone, one that is extremely bright and moving and alive and energetic and sometimes explosive. And Steve Jobs is no exception. To compare this film to The Social Network, as Danny Boyle himself explained, this film has an open energy, whereas Fincher's The Social Network has a very compressed energy. And on this film, Danny Boyle's really trying to capture that restless, ever-moving mind of Steve Jobs, whereas on The Social Network, David Fincher is trying to capture more of that compressed, quite still strategizing that Mark Zuckerberg does. And some of my favorite moments visually on Steve Jobs were when Danny Boyle actually externalized some of the internal things that are happening in Steve Jobs' mind. And I won't spoil exactly what happens, but they're a beautiful example of how alive and theatrical Danny Boyle's style is, which actually directly leads me to another compliment for his style and why it fits so perfectly with Sorkin's writing. Because Aaron Sorkin's writing can be rather theatrical. And when not handled well, sometimes the writing and the direction on an Aaron Sorkin film or television show can sometimes clash. And though a show like The Newsroom, in my opinion, ultimately found its feet, I did feel like that was one of my main critiques of it earlier on. With this film, though, from the outset, you could definitely feel Danny Boyle's very theatrical staging and blocking, which if you watch closely repeat and rhyme with one another, one act to another. And speaking of those acts, I really loved how Danny Boyle visually separated them one to the other, by shooting the first act on 16mm, the second act on 35mm, and the third act on digital. And not only did that help the visuals and keep things distinct and separate, it also played specifically into the theme, and specifically into the person of Steve Jobs, who was ever trying to marry and mash together art and technology. I also have to compliment the editing, because in a couple moments I felt like the editing was a bit convoluted. They were cutting back and forth between a present-day conversation and a past conversation, and it felt like I was kind of losing track of what was happening and what the focal point of that scene was. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that is in fact the point. It really felt like Aaron Sorkin and the editors were trying to say, this is a man so fixated on that past event and so defined by it that he's not able to be present and to listen to the things that are being said to him right now. And though Jobs felt a little disconnected from reality in that moment, the cast never once felt disconnected from this film, which is so impressive considering how rhythmic and poetic Sorkin's dialogue is. And I love hearing Jeff Daniels actually talk about memorizing and learning Sorkin's dialogue by saying, you've got to wrestle it down, get on top of it, and then you can go anywhere with it. And the cast absolutely did that. Never once did I feel like they were getting lost in the sheer volume of the words that they had to say. And Fassbender definitely led the way in that regard. Here is an actor that, whether he's on Shame, 12 Years a Slave, or an X-Men film, captures so well those individuals that we may initially think we can easily paint into a corner, but then on closer inspection discover there are so many competing ideas in their mind, and so many differing points of view that they're wrestling with, and that's no easy task, and one that this film absolutely requires. And it was so cool hearing Danny Boyle talk about Michael Fassbender's process when tackling Steve Jobs by saying, you can feel him grappling with this monster of a part that Aaron's written, just like Jobs is wrestling against IBM. And I have to mention Kate Winslet, who just did a masterful job portraying that middleman, so to speak, and just wrestling with those questions of, do I take a side? Which side do I take? Do I speak up? Can I speak up after 15 years of silence? And finally, the level of truth and authenticity that Danny Boyle was able to draw out of the young actresses that played Steve Jobs' daughter was just astounding. I mean, they really could hold their own in the scene with Michael Fassbender, Kate Winslet, and Jeff Daniels. Now, to talk about a few of the things that didn't work as well for me on the film, I was actually surprised to discover that there were a couple different scenes, in the writing especially, I felt like there was a level of insecurity. Like Sorkin was feeling just a little bit sheepish at the absurdity over the fact that these specific characters would continue to have these specific conversations, kind of pick up where they left off 4 years later or even 10 years later. And there were just a couple lines that he threw in there that felt very insecure to me. Like he was realizing that and kind of winking at the audience, being like, oh, I know what I'm doing here and it's fine. I feel like he could have just easily cut those moments and more wholly and confidently embraced the very theatrical nature of this film. There were also just one or two lines in the film that felt a little bit on the nose to me and a little bit preachy as far as characters kind of coming out and just stating the theme of the piece, and I could have done without those as well. Now, I wanted to kind of wrap up by addressing briefly some of the criticisms that this film has taken, just as far as the accuracy of its portrayal of past events and the truthfulness in presenting real-life people like Steve Jobs. It's an issue that Sorkin himself has addressed numerous times by saying things like, there is a difference between journalism and what we do, which is the same difference between a photograph and a painting. It's our job to be subjective. Or Danny Boyle saying things like, this film is more of an abstract, and even positing that part of the reason why they cast Michael Fassbender is he didn't look like Steve Jobs, which would assist the audience in looking at this as something other than a documentary. And I think the greatest flaw to Sorkin's thinking here is that most people do actually walk into a film like this, a film that has been marketed as being based on a true story, thinking that they're going to view a photograph and not a painting. They're going to view the facts and walk out with a genuinely accurate understanding of what happened and who it happened to and who those people are. And I don't actually believe that that way of thinking and way of going into a film is in and of itself flawed. If, and only if, the people who walk out of that film are willing to dig a little deeper. If they're willing to allow that film to not be the end-all, but rather a springboard to further learning and deeper understanding of past events. And I think that is so Sorkin. And I think Sorkin really expects a lot from the audience. And I think some would say too much. But he absolutely wants people to understand in a deeper way the world around them, the people that populate that world, and by extension, themselves. And that is, I would argue, precisely what this film is trying to accomplish. As fast and as dense as Steve Jobs is, there is still a simplicity and a clarity to its narrative. This isn't a documentary on the life of Steve Jobs. Those exist out there aplenty, and they should be viewed and learned from. No, this isn't the symphony of Steve Jobs' life, with every stanza, measure, and bar included. Rather, it's Aaron Sorkin riffing on certain melodies in his life, and allowing us to hear the sound of the greatness and brilliance in his mind, and the brokenness within his heart. And by extension, allowing us to hear the genius in our own minds, and the brokenness in our own hearts. So for all those reasons, I will give Steve Jobs 4 out of 5. I highly recommend this film. Those are just my thoughts, though, so please comment below and let me know what you guys thought. Did you like the film? Did you hate it? How much do you love Aaron Sorkin? Do you not like him so much? Did you really like Danny Boyle's direction, or would you have preferred if David Fincher stayed on? And what's your opinion on films that are based on true stories? Please comment below and let me know. Also, please do subscribe. This will not be the last time that I talk about films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But, for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.